It is the mitochondria that sets up the innate response for your immune system. And that is why the people who struggle with COVID were the diabetics and the metabolic syndromes and the obese and the hypertensives. And they already have mitochondria that are like limping along.
Dr. Christabel Yeo, welcome to the podcast. Now, you're on this podcast because I was speaking at the ACNEM conference, the Australian College of Nutritional Environmental Medicine, and you were speaking a little bit before me, and I was absolutely captivated. You talked about my two favourite subjects. In one, you talked about hormesis, and you talked about the mitochondria, and I think I was a bit through my talk, and I said, where's Christabel? and I was like, where have you been all my life?
Yeah. That was funny. I was very chuffed. Thank you. I was like, oh.
No, that because it was such a good, that's probably the best talk in fact, it is the best talk I've seen in years at any conference. And I thought, you must be some geeky researcher who has spent their whole career diving into the mitochondria and hormesis, but you're not. You're actually a GP. So tell our listeners about just your journey and why you got interested in this and why you became an integrative GP as well, and maybe define that because some people may not be aware of the difference.
Okay. Well, I'll also define, actually, some people maybe don't know that the difference between being a physician and a GP. I'm actually a physician. I was trained in the UK. And I was on my way to being a gastroenterologist, and I was all into nutrition and things like that. And then I realized in my gastro clinics that I couldn't do very much in 10 minutes in the NHS, in the wonderful Whitechapel Hospital in East London. And I decided, well, I don't think I can work in this kind of environment where I have 10 minutes to talk to patients and to treat very chronic symptoms. And as much as I loved hospital medicine and acute medicine, I decided I would just specialize in nutrition and go into private practice as a physician. And so that's what I did 18 years ago. I've been a doctor for almost 25 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You're like the female version of Peter Pan.
Well, perhaps it's the Asian genes and, Well, to be honest, everything I've taught my patients, I do myself. And I really started off in environmental medicine and nutrition and environmental medicine. I know about all what's toxic. I know all about what not to do. Don't invite me to your parties because I'm a real party pooper. I'm like, don't eat that, don't drink that. But anyway, so that was my journey into being, in Australia, they call them integrative doctors.
Yeah.
But yeah, my background is in environmental and nutritional medicine.
And when you do your basic doctor training, did you do it in the UK?
Mm.
How much nutritional education did you get in the basic training?
I don't remember any.
Yeah, I think some places it's 2 weeks, some medical schools it's none, isn't it?
No, it's not, never 2 weeks. It's usually one lecture or half a day here, half a day there. I don't actually remember any, but maybe because I didn't turn up. But I did a master's degree in human nutrition at King's College in London. Like when I decided, I was a gastroenterology registrar, and I decided I can't really practice like this. I'm going to go back to school and study nutrition. So I went and got a postgrad master's in nutrition, and then I went back into medicine. So that's how I did it.
Interesting. That's it. So you had you finished your residency and things like that?
Yeah.
Okay. And then you went back and did a master's. Wow. That's that's pretty full on. And taking a year out after doing all that training and just getting to the point where, hey, I can now earn some money. And then you went back to university and did a master's.
Yeah. And so because of doing that and then being in private practice and really thinking outside of just regular acute medicine, which I love, but really doctor's everyday work is very much chronic disease. You really have to think about, well, what are all the drivers, the contributors, the lifestyle factors, the toxicities of the environment. So I was doing that really, and the sorts of patients that I was seeing, chronic fatigue syndromes, and all sorts of syndromes that medicine couldn't label, couldn't understand, and indeed were more complex. So they would come to doctors like us because they've seen the neurologists, they've seen the rheumatologists, they've seen the gastroenterologists. Maybe they have a label, maybe they don't. A lot of the times the first start would get the people who didn't have the labels but know that there's something wrong and it's not just in their head. And then they would come to environmental medicine doctors like myself. So from doing that, I've had experience of very complex, very strange, very complicated conditions. But really, when you just go back to physiology, biochemistry, understanding the body globally as a huge, systems biology thing, that you have to know a bit of everything. So it is like being a GP and not being a specialist. And then we go right down to the cellular levels.
And it gets ridiculously complex when you get down to the cellular level, doesn't it? And the whole physiology and then how nutrition interacts with our cells and all of the cell processes. I want to zero in on metabolic health in general, but then do a dive into the mitochondria, because that's really the thing that captivated me about your talk. So metabolic syndrome is a collection of things, and there's different, as you and I both know, there are different criteria depending on who you listen to, but typically 3 from 5 of central obesity, high blood pressure, high triglycerides, low HDL, and high fasting glucose. Why that cluster? Why is that cluster so important, and the interaction between those things?
Why it's important, I think, just plays out in that's where the rubber hits the road in terms of the interactions of where we see chronic disease happen, which is cardiovascular health, heart attacks, strokes, dementia, and then, the various range of blood clotting type of issues. Because that's rubber hits the road is like the endothelial system. And that endothelial system, the mitochondria play a huge role in looking after that. Maybe we can come to that later. But then, the mitochondria also play a huge role in, keeping your blood sugar level and things like that. But I think from a medical definition of the high fasting insulin, the high blood sugar, the high triglycerides, that's because together that's just a train wreck in the endothelial vasculature.
And it's basically, you're kind of, from a layman's perspective, metabolically, you're starting to fall apart when you have that cluster. I remember when I was doing my first attempt at a PhD, which I then moved on to something else, but one of my supervisors, she was a doctor and a researcher, and she said to me, because I was doing a study where measuring metabolic syndrome in people, and often, they take the central obesity, the high blood pressure, the triglycerides, the low HDL, but often their glucose wasn't too bad. And she said to me, glucose is typically the last thing to go. And that gives people a false sense of security, because they tend to really look at their glucose and type 2 diabetes and they think, I'm okay. But is that your observation as well, that it tends to be the last to go?
Oh, absolutely. It's funny that we're having this discussion, because that was my conclusion 20 years ago. And I don't care what your blood glucose is, but I will do an insulin, and more interested, I get all my patients to do a continuous glucose monitor. So yes, I do care what the glucose is, but not just on that Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. fasting test. It's like, okay, it's 5.4 and that's not very good. I'd like to see it around 4.5, but it's inside the normal range and everyone thinks they've got away with it and they're fine. But if you do a continuous glucose monitor and you see the pattern through the day, the days and the weeks, then you start to see all the zigzag peaks and troughs that people go through. And that is the big driver for insulin resistance.
Yeah, and I'm a massive fan of a continuous glucose monitor. I think everybody should try it at least once, because it gives you some really interesting insights, doesn't it? Because one food for you might spike your blood glucose ridiculously, and then for me it'll be fine, and then another food it'll be vice versa, right? And this one size fits all approach is complete and utter nonsense when it comes to nutrition.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not just the food, but how you put the food together on the plate, and then what you do after eating it, or what have you done before eating it. And then sometimes even when you haven't even eaten, what's your cortisol levels like, adrenaline levels like. You learn all sorts of great things around your whole, psychology and everything.
Yeah, and that what you do after you eat as well, and the mix of stuff, right? Having protein, having fat with it really reduces the big spike, having some citrus, but even just going for a walk after dinner has a profound effect on people's blood glucose, isn't it? If I was the czar of the universe, I would make everybody go for a walk after dinner.
If you were czar of the universe, Paul, we would all be unbreakable and the world would be completely different. And I wouldn't have a job.
I wouldn't have grumpy people.
No, well, I wouldn't have a job, and I'd be delighted.
So we know if you have metabolic syndrome, your risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, chronic kidney disease, PCOS, sleep apnea, cancers, dementia, look, it all goes through the roof. And that's really the crux of the issue, isn't it? It's metabolism gone wrong for people.
Yes. And what's underlying the metabolism gone wrong is the metabolic pathways, of course, and what determines the metabolic pathways is the mitochondria. And that's why after, almost 20 years of nutritional integrated medicine, I've landed squarely on the mitochondria. I mean, I've been following the whole mitochondria story for about over 10 years. And really it's seeking more and more answers for the sick, the very complex, very unnameable chronic neurological weird illnesses. And you have to come down to really, in the end, what works in the patients. And I find that that's where one has to go to.
And so why your interest? I mean, you've been interested in the mitochondria much longer than me. I've come to it probably in the last 5 years, and then just realized how critical it is. So can we talk about, just for the lay people who might even not know what mitochondria is, give us a bit of a definition, and then just give us a sense of what your mitochondria do in the body, how widespread they are, how they're involved in your overall health, both physical and mental.
Okay, so I mean, starting at the beginning, just from a cell biology perspective, mitochondria are little mini structures, so organelles, mini organelles inside the cell, like 100 to 1,000 of them, depending on what kind of cell you are, a nerve cell, a brain cell, a muscle cell, a bone cell, whatever. So the number of mitochondria depends on what the function is of that cell, and the more energy that cell needs, the more mitochondria there are. So that would be all the neurons, all the muscles. That's where we have got most mitochondria, because they can never stop. Like your heart never stops, your brain never stops. When you sleep, it's all still pumping, working away. So the mitochondria, typically we've all learned it as they are the organelles that make energy for the cell. And the terminology that's been used for a long time is mitochondria are powerhouses of the cell, and they power up everything. And that really is true. But in my talk, I was just trying to bring a bit of a nuance in that it's not they're not just pumping out energy because we need more energy, we want more energy. The nuance is that we actually also have to do things to feed the energy, like create the whole environment, the whole landscape that the mitochondria make energy very fluidly and just very naturally, rather than like we're trying to squeeze out this energy. So that my talk wanted to bring more nuance, because it was a group of doctors and integrative practitioners, and we all know that we've given supplements for mitochondrial energy, blah blah, but So we'll come to the more nuance later, but back to the basics of mitochondria. So they are, in fact, processing energy, and they're like a battery of the cell. And like batteries, there's positive, negative charge. They hold the charge, and it's like a capacitor that, that gives you energy. And mitochondria have their own genes. So that's also a newer level of discussion around mitochondria. Not just that they make energy, but they've got their own genes. They've got 37 genes. The rest of our cell in the nucleus, everybody knows we've got all our DNA. There's 20,000 genes in there. But the mitochondria have 37 genes, and half of those genes make the most important energy-producing, like machinery, proteins, pathways for making energy. So if that doesn't work, the genes there aren't happy, which is the discussions on epigenetics. Like, what are you doing that alters your genetic function? So if you're doing things that your mitochondria genes and the epigenetics is not too happy about what you're doing, then it's going to alter how much energy you are transducing through that mitochondria. So that would be the basics, that mitochondria are there to power up our biology, and why they do it is like amazingly complex with its evolutionary pathways. They're highly conserved. They didn't just change over a few generations. They've been there like forever. And then how it came about with prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So all that like early life genetics that comes from the work of Nick Lane.
Because
London.
these cells that you just mentioned, they're some of the earliest life on Earth, right? So
yeah.
The mitochondria have been around since there was life on Earth.
Yeah.
That's pretty friggin' important, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So they've been around since there's been life on Earth, because they just knew how to use oxygen. And life on Earth was about like sulfur and all those hot gases from the vents deep in the sea, and then oxygen bubbling up, and then how's life going to be formed? And somehow by magic, these early life forms knew or found ways to use oxygen. So mitochondria need to use oxygen. That's its obligate function. If it doesn't use oxygen, it's just half-assed, basically. Like, it's just creeping along, and you end up in anaerobic metabolism, which when the cell just has basic energy through sugars and glycolysis, but not through really burning fat, not through really burning through oxygen, not making heaps more ATP, that energy currency in the cell.
Are there certain behaviors, lifestyle behaviors, that then ramp down the effectiveness of the mitochondria and switch us into that more anaerobic metabolism? And then what are the issues with that? Obviously, when we're exercising, if you're exercising intensely, right, then you're in anaerobic metabolism. But I'm talking just generally, what are some of the issues of the mitochondria not working well?
It would be feeding it a lot of sugar, or just feeding the system sugar. If you just have simple glucose and you can just rely on glycolysis, and let's say there's not enough oxygen around, so let's say, well, broadly speaking, I suppose it would be breathing, moving. Exercise definitely does play into it. We can't quite split it apart. Yes, if you're exercising intensively, then you're going on anaerobic, but just the fact of blood moving, pumping, there's going to be oxygen flow, your breathing is that whole movement of things. But if there isn't that, and that's not moving very well, and then there's just a lot of sugar and glucose, then you don't need to kick all the fatty acid, it's called beta oxidation pathways, into gear. You could just sort of be very lazy and rely on glucose. And so it's a whole lifetime or years of doing that you can just down train your metabolic pathways to not learn how to burn fat very well.
I interviewed Professor Richard Johnson on the podcast. He produced a really interesting research paper around fructose and how fructose creates a metabolic crisis in the mitochondria. And his research is really interesting because he was an anthropologist originally, and he studied the great apes. And he showed that the great apes, millions of years ago, had a genetic mutation. Some of them were, when they ate fructose, they got fat. And that was naturally selected for. And he's shown that basically it's to do with the uricase gene, that every Homo sapien on the planet has the same version of the uricase gene, where when we overconsume fructose, we create a metabolic crisis and we shut down energy production in the mitochondria that then ramps up our hunger mechanisms and just basically shuts down your energy. Are you familiar with that stuff?
I can't remember about all those pathways. I've heard them before, but I have looked into it.
Poyol pathway, I think it was the Poyol pathway from memory.
And when we eat fructose, you actually need to use more ATP to convert it to glucose before you can use it as energy. And so it was a bit of a misunderstanding to think that you could just eat heaps of fruit to get more energy. You are filling the liver up with more fatty liver, basically, more glycogen. And then it takes more energy to get ATP from fructose than from glucose.
Yeah, and so that's where the metabolic crisis comes. So Chris Palmer. So I read his book recently about brain energy, which I'm presuming that you have read as well. I mean, that was pretty fascinating, showing, and it kind of makes sense, right? When I read it, I'm like, oh, duh, well, yeah, of course, right? Because as you said, and I never thought about it this way, we know the brain is very, very hungry energetically, right? It's like 2 to 3% of your body weight, but uses 25 to 30% of the energy. And it's the mitochondria that are pretty central to this. And he basically showed that pretty much every mental health condition, or more than mental health, actually, and brain health issues are at least partly because of mitochondrial dysfunction. So talk us through that a little bit. Like, how does that happen?
I think when you say it's partly mitochondrial dysfunction, I would say it's partly because the picture is different in everyone. Why is someone Parkinson's, someone MS, someone ALS? And so you might think, well, the mitochondria is partly at play because everyone is presenting differently. But I would say that the mitochondria is wholly, fundamentally underlying the neurophysiological inflammatory processes that haven't been able to be pulled back, like they're full in force because the mitochondria haven't got enough bioenergetics behind it to pull back and to regulate. So I'd say that mitochondrial dysfunction is inside every neurological condition: neuroinflammatory, autism, depression, schizophrenia, mental health, brain health. I mean, I don't like saying mental health. I say brain health because it is.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so why does that happen? It's really the balance of mitochondrial mismatch. And that's the work put together by Robert Naviaux. So in about 2011 or 12, he published his first set of papers on something called the cell danger response.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Before that, he was obviously already a mitochondrial researcher. He's a pediatric geneticist, MD from the US, I think UCSD. And so the cell danger response is when the metabolic / mitochondrial pathways just cannot anymore handle all the information overload. So the information overload comes from those highly conserved metabolic mitochondrial pathways that have to deal with what evolved with us, which is what are the signals coming from attackers. So the attackers would usually be viruses, but can be bacteria as well. So in the Precambrian, prokaryotic sea of life, it was just like viruses, and mitochondria knew how to live with that, and they just had their ways of managing their ions, their metal ions, their anions, cations, is to save resources for themselves, or they're being stolen by a virus, or that they're fighting to keep that back. So the cell danger response is the mitochondria dealing with attack, or the attack is not too bad. So he calls it peacetime and wartime metabolism. So when we have wartime metabolism, we have viruses, we have bacteria and infections that are overwhelming the innate immune pathways, which are set up by the mitochondria. Because some people would know, okay, yeah, innate pathways when you have a virus and then you get your first immune system response, and then adaptive pathways and memory for later. Yes, but at that very tiny cellular mitochondrial level, it is the mitochondria that sets up the innate response for your immune system. And that is why, well, guess why the people who struggled with COVID were the diabetics and the metabolic syndromes and the obese and the hypertensives, and they already have mitochondria that are like limping along, like.
Yeah, interesting. So they've already got damaged mitochondria, and then you have COVID and the cytokine storm that goes with that. And it's because they've got weak, defenseless mitochondria that they get overwhelmed, basically, their immune systems.
Yeah, so the innate immunity is before the cytokine storm. So the cytokine storm will only unfurl and not get balanced or pulled back if there isn't enough mitochondrial resource and the cell danger response is too overwhelming. So the cell danger response would be fighting the external world of bad guys. But if nowadays the external world of bad guys is sugar, glucose, poor metabolic pathways from not enough muscle mass, too much adipose tissue, not exercising, blah, blah. And then excess glucose is also taking away resources from the mitochondria. And then the last bit would be toxins. So in the Precambrian times, they probably didn't have toxins, but they had maybe natural toxins of, mercury, too much sulfur or too much nitrogen, things like that. But today's world of toxins is a whole different story, right? Like we're totally overloaded with heavy metals, with endocrine disrupting chemicals, with PFAS. Like all those things are basically tying your mitochondria's hands behind their back and using up their resources. So then you end up having a system that just doesn't have enough power inside of itself to deal with what would be natural and normal to meet viruses. That's natural and normal. But then it's become unnatural and abnormal to have such a heavy toxic load and to eat the way we do.
And then you throw in a lack of physical activity and poor diet as well. And then what's happening, from a very simplistic perspective, if I just kind of pull back, is number one, your mitochondria are getting overloaded from all of these toxic insults. But because of the lifestyle, your mitochondria really aren't well trained, right? It's like having dad's army who have just done no training whatsoever, and they're pretty weak and pathetic. And then you put them up against an army of different invaders, all coming from different directions. It's not hard to see now how everything gets overwhelmed. So when you add all of those different toxins and insults from the environment, the oxidative stress, and then, we haven't even talked about adipose tissue and what happens with adipose tissue from a metabolic perspective, and particularly visceral fat, right, which is different completely. And then you're not exercising and you're having shit or sleep.
Yeah.
It's a disaster, isn't it?
Yeah. So you, as a sports scientist, you want to talk about like myokines and adipokines, right?
Yes.
So all the inflammatory kinds or signaling that comes from muscles and fat. And so mitochondria have the same. They have mitokines. So mitokines are the signaling of that cell danger response to say, okay, are we in wartime metabolism? Do we have to put barriers up around our boundaries? other invaders coming in from the different countries, and they literally put barriers up around the boundaries, and that's what cell membranes do. So the mitochondria inside the cells will know that there's a fight coming, and then they're going to change the structure of the phospholipids of the cell membranes, and they're going to change the signaling. And what they do is they release ATP, not as energy, which is what we said earlier. ATP is typically known as the energy currency. But ATP is also a mitokine. And ATP, when it's produced outside of the cell, so inside the mitochondria, they're producing ATP, and that's energy. But then there's like, oh, there's war, open your gates, get the armies out, send all these signals. The ATP will come outside of the mitochondria, outside of the cell, and that is your equivalent of your adipokine and your myokines, and it's signaling danger. And then that's when you start to trigger off all that cytokine storm and what's called the NLRP3 inflammasomes.
Right, okay, which then drives lots of different conditions, right, from metabolic in the body to the brain as well. Let's talk a little bit about mitohormesis, right? So my listeners will be pretty familiar with hormesis because they know I'm a big fan. And you talked about hormesis on the stage, which is why I'm like, where have you been all my life, right? So talk to us about just, go anywhere with you want with this, just around hormesis, and then diving into mitohormesis, what it is, why it's useful, all of these sorts of things. Just give us that primer on it.
So hormesis, when I first learned that word, would be in toxicology. And as an environmental physician, my background was learning a lot about toxicology. And hormesis was that word that described that J-shaped curve of the dose makes the response. So low dose is okay, high dose could kill you. But then, interestingly, there were other fields that were overlapping, like homeopathy, which is technically not scientific,
Yes.
But
technically woo-woo, but from a hormesis lens.
But from a hormesis lens, they were showing that the dose makes a response as well, and that whether it's a physical low dose of a heavy metal or a plastic or radiation, things that are, said to be bad for you in big doses, low doses did do something beneficial for the system. So the body had this adaptive response to get a signal, learn something, and upregulate a pathway to deal with it. And if the dose is just right, then you learn that pathway to deal with it in a positive way that helps and supports biology and creates resilience. But if the dose is too high, then that's that J-shaped curve that you fall off the other end. That's not good for you. So hormesis from the very beginning was how I learned it was all around exposure to toxicity. But then in the last decade, it's very much been around bringing it into the longevity discussions and aging discussions. And then now mito-resilience, bringing it into the discussion of psychobiology. So there's that, maybe we'll come to this later, mitochondrial psychobiology, which I love. But all different words for the same things that we love. So yeah, mito-resilience, the hormesis, what was not very well understood, like why does hormesis exist? Like, it was very strange. Nature does these things very strangely. It's like, wow, that was what they observed, but could never really explain it. But we are observing more and more of these pathways and understanding it more. And in the end, it's like nature exists, but science is there to try and explain nature.
And can I just jump in with some real practical learnings from hormesis for people? It's kind of summed up by Friedrich Nietzsche, right? That which does not kill us makes us stronger. And he just forgot the brackets, as long as you get the dose correct, right?
Yeah.
So it was Edward Calabrese, I think, was one of the first to discover it when he was a PhD student. And he was giving levels of plant toxins, what's the name of them? Pesticides to plants. And he was trying to work out what was the minimal effective dose to kill a plant. And he found, at certain doses, the plant died. And then as he reduced it, the plants started to flourish and grew better than plants who hadn't had any poison effectively. That was where it kind of first got learned. But now we know British medical radiologists who were exposed to what they thought was high, dangerous levels of radiation in the 60s, actually, when they were followed up, had less cancer than their peers who weren't exposed to it. And there's a whole heap of things like Chernobyl accident recovery workers, not the ones who were in Chernobyl at the time of the nuclear leak, but the ones who went in to rescue them. And they thought, oh God, these guys got too much radiation, they're going to get cancer. They followed them up. They got less cancer than other workers who were the same, basically same as them, but who hadn't gone in to do the recovery, so had not been exposed to the radiation. And so, exercise is a hermetic stressor, cold, heat, all of those sorts of things. So I wanted to give it that hormesis a real world context for people, right? Before we dive into the mito stuff.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating what you shared. Thank you. That was, just what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And so back to the mito resilience or mito hormesis, it is the mitochondria's metabolic pathways that allows this amazing thing called hormesis to actually unfold in a positive way to make you stronger and better and more adaptive and so on. And it is the foundation for adaptive medicine. And adaptive medicine, from the Russians.
Oh, that's a nice term, adaptive medicine. That's cool.
Yeah. So the adaptive medicine really came originally from the Russians. Adaptive medicine is not used very much, but we've been using it more in our recent new practice. And because it's really wanting to teach people to adapt better. But they, of course, true to the Russians, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And they're sending up their fighter pilots with no cockpit and they're up in hypoxia. Well, how do you train these guys to survive hypoxia? Well, do hypoxic training. So hypoxic training and probably in the sports world, you probably know it as altitude training. It's like that is seriously powerful adaptive medicine at play. And why does it work? Because when you expose your mitochondria to what it evolved in, like mitochondria evolved through nature, knowing how to deal with cold, how to deal with not enough oxygen. So when you expose yourself to not enough oxygen, there's just all these highly conserved pathways that go, oh, I remember that, kick in. Let's upregulate those oxygen using oxygen efficiency pathways. And then you get these incredibly strong mitochondria from regularly exposing and training yourself in hypoxia. So intermittent hypoxic training is one of my favorite amazing metabolic resilience training tools. Not just in sports, there's a ton of research of it in sports and NASA and the Army and all of that. But there's now, thankfully, increasing research in what I deal with, the chronic disease end of the spectrum with chronic fatigue syndromes, long COVID for sure, metabolic syndromes. There's good literature on reversing metabolic disease, type 2 diabetes. If you catch it early enough and you just do IHT, intermittent hypoxic training, you can actually reverse metabolic syndrome.
Wow, because you're then stimulating the mitochondria to adapt, right?
The whole body.
I wanted to just, you talked about conserved, you'd mentioned a couple of times, just in case that word has slipped past our listeners. When you say conserved, you mean conserved evolutionarily. So it's been present for millions of years, right? So these are ancient cellular responses to mild stress that create adaptation that actually then benefits the host, right? That's right. The key thing.
That's the key thing, and that's the key thing that Robert Naviaux was really highlighting in that whole new generation of mitochondrial discussions from 10 years ago. It's these conserved pathways, not just that they make you energy. There's these conserved pathways that have to be almost seen to, understood, where do they fit in. So then if you've got too much toxicity, not enough nutrient load, then those conserved pathways take a different direction because that's how they are that's how they are.
Tell me this, how does, I don't know if you've any experience in this, but hyperbaric oxygen therapy, does that play into mitohormesis, or are we talking a different pathway here?
It does play in, and it probably plays in at a different level in terms of how strong you want to get, let's say. So it does play in that hyperbaric oxygen is considered a hormetic stress. So that is also, it's like, well, if you think Goldilocks, not too much, not too little, just right. But yeah, I mean, you do want to do both. So hyperbaric is a stress. And for the patient category where they are not well, there is, especially like TBIs, brain conditions, their redox pathways are not going very well, they're not recovering from exercise, things like that. Hyperbaric oxygen definitely is useful, has a role to play. And I love hyperbaric oxygen. I use it a lot in my patients. But I would say that if I was an athlete, like I wasn't a sick patient, then I'd be doing IHT. So it's just the level of where is your training capacity at. Your redox is pretty good and you're quite well, and you don't necessarily need hyperbaric oxygen, which you
don't need that. It's expensive, right?
And it's a more passive thing. It's not that expensive because it's becoming more popular now. But yeah, I mean, whether it's $80 or $120 a session, depending where you go, for sure. But intermittent hypoxic training is probably around the same cost or more, depending on the systems that you use. But it's more that it's training to, whether you want to call it a deeper level of getting deep into those metabolic pathways that can really be trained up, and training you to therefore deep, thus higher level, rather than passively helping you.
Gotcha. So if you have some sort of chronic disease, HBOT and the hyperbaric oxygen can be more appropriate. But if you're functioning well and you just want to function even better in terms of performance, cellular and exercise performance, then the intermittent hypoxia is the way ahead. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it is. I mean, if I was an athlete, and I'm not really, if I was an athlete, then I would do all that exercise that you do, and then I do IHT regularly, and then I would recover with cold, and I would recover with red light.
Yes. I do want to talk about red light, but before we get on to, just because we're talking about oxygen, but so carbon dioxide, so intermittent exposure to higher levels of carbon dioxide also seems to be beneficial. Are you familiar with any of this stuff? Talk us through this.
Yes, I am. I'm not sure about intermittent levels of carbon dioxide, because the way I see it is, first, carbon dioxide needs to be at a particular level or a minimal level. And when people drop below that level, then that's when we see problems. So the problems are related, they're called a few different names, but some people call it hyperventilation syndrome. Some people call it hypocapnic syndrome. It's just low CO2. So CO2 should sit probably anywhere between 35 to 40 millimeters of mercury. But a lot of people are sitting at 31, 32. And if you're not very good and that kind of breathing very fast, quite experiencing a lot of anxiety, maybe it's chronic pain. It's not like it's just psychological. It's neurophysiological to breathe fast and to breathe more when you're in pain, in discomfort, in distress, feeling some level of emotional, whether it's abuse or trauma or whatever, people will just breathe faster. So then that CO2 will drop when you breathe faster. And when your CO2 drops, then you lose mitoresilience. You lose resilience overall of the neurophysiology. So then the nerves, they're more twitchy, because carbon dioxide is actually a gaseous neurotransmitter as well, a bit like nitric oxide.
Interesting, yeah. So I'm talking about here deliberate hypercapnia. So carbon dioxide, CO2 tolerance training, like free divers and some athletes now are doing, and some amazing benefits from so it's a hormetic stressor, intermittent hypercapnia. And I know a couple of guys who train athletes and are getting them to do carbon dioxide tolerance training. and actually getting really good increases in physical performance afterwards. And it's this hormetic stressor that which does not kill you makes you stronger, but you get that wrong and you die. Right.
Yeah. I'd love to read more about what the hypercapnia does just at the mitochondrial level. I don't know, but I do know that it's a bit like, they call it, with mitoresilience and psychophysical resilience. So it's like these free divers and people you're pointing to, they're already trained up at a particular level. You can be sure they do not experience hypocapnia.
Yes.
You can be sure their CO2 is already super good. You can be sure they're already very good at breath holding and all of this. So they're already at a very optimized, like, redox, mitochondrial, cellular level. And because they've got that, they're pulling in so much capacity of their mind. So the mind mitochondria, so they can pull in so much more, like, focus and training and pushing, like, major boundaries with their mind. And what can they do with the heart rate variability, and their vagal tone must be amazing. And they'll be like the modern yogis of the underworld,
That's
like
right.
The undersea world.
Yeah, there's some pretty cool stuff actually about carbon dioxide tolerance training. Your carbon dioxide tolerance is actually predictive of success in special forces selection, because it's a general marker of overall psychological distress tolerance, right? Because it's friggin' horrible doing that type of training. It's really, psychologically, it's really tough as well as physically challenging. Hey, everybody. So unfortunately, that brings us to the end of part 1 with Dr. Christabel. And we have covered all of the essentials of metabolic health, and particularly the role of the mitochondria. Make sure you tune in next week, where Christabel goes through a whole range of practical strategies that we can do to enhance our mitochondrial health and therefore our overall health, including exercise, nutritional and light strategies. Catch you next week.